¿Tú corres aquí?
Vaya. Small living.
No, la verdad que llevo un año
El edificio está muy
New
bonito.
link.
Yeah.
Okay,
ya,
that's
ya
fine.
terraza porque ahora es de noche.
I'm
no he
gonna
visto,
just
pero está
send
muy
me that
bien.
the email and then I'm gonna
Llevo
put
un
it in the,
año.
Where's that plug
año
this
más o
in?
menos,
Is
así.
that like
Oh, I'll
Mozart?
plug it in.
Okay, great. Thank you.
O sea, también porque la tecnología que tocamos, el stack, o sea, es como que no nos quedamos atrás, es lo que cabe. O sea, tenemos también el código de
just grab a
JavaScript,
seat whenever you want.
pero por ejemplo, para una parte ya
We're gonna
estamos con
start.
TypeScript
Okay.
y bueno, también en nuestro backend está
Aquí
hecho Java.
está el...
Entonces, estoy en un equipo que es, o sea, soy frontend, pero si tenía que cambiar algo al final, pues tienes que ir a Java y ver qué está pasando. Y no sé, yo el primer trabajo que tengo así de programador
No, mucho.
para aprender
Lo contrario.
me gusta.
Así.
Sí.
Y ahora.
Si estás buscando pues, TDS, yo recomiendo.
Electric switch. Oh, okay, maybe this is not the cable or it is.
Sí, no es que flipa, o sea, del año pasado que entré, que éramos
If you can just like,
a
move
80 y
that
poco,
to the
ahora hemos pasado ya
projector.
como a 160. O sea, ahora estamos en un proceso que es como muy fácil. Entonces, bueno, ahora parece que saldrá podcast de recursos
Yeah,
humanos,
that's how it
que tampoco lo que es más lo típico, que lo que hacemos.
Okay, cool.
is.
That's it. So, how I can project.
Ahora lo que sí que estamos buscando, que está complicado,
Oh, so the
developers de
remove that.
Pásalo con link, a ver si se interesa. Sí, porque al final todo nuestro software está hecho en JavaScript puro, o sea, vanilla JavaScript. Y ahora pues queremos
Great.
empezar a migrar un
Okay.
poco a React,
Let me start then.
entonces nos faltará soporte para poder hacer
Can I give you this just in case? I don't want
esto
to
también.
lose it.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. Thank you everyone for coming. This is really important for us to help the community doing these sessions, workshops, trainings, and those things. We're gonna have an announcement from the host, Marville, this amazing offices. So thank them to host us. That's amazing. I'm gonna also talk a little bit about React.js Academy and what we do, and then let's just learn a lot of React Native with Nader. So who knows Nader from internet or somewhere else? No? Yes. So that's why he's here. So he can be So
The two people.
okay. So Olga, if you want to start, I don't know if you want me to put the Markfield website over there or
Yes.
yes. Okay, can do that.
Okay.
I can do that. I know how to enter a website. Come. There you go.
Okay, so thank you very much for coming here today. Welcome to our office. My name is Olga. I work in data department of Martin. This is my colleague Victor. He's one of our developers. So here, first of all, who knows what we do in Martin? Who knows something about the company? Not the Marfil employees. Okay. We are a tech startup company, and our clients are publishers and professional bloggers, content-based websites. So our platform is our product is a platform that adapts their desktop content into mobile devices. For those who are from here, you can check on your mobile, for example, Confidencial or Periodista Digital, just to see an example of the product. So regarding the technologies, we work with JavaScript, HTML, and CSS in the front end. Now we are starting to migrate to React. On the back end, we work with Java and Spring. We also have a project with PHP and WordPress. And we are hiring. We are looking for lots of developers. We have lots of open positions, different kinds of seniority levels, from people who have zero experience with coding to very senior profiles. And we're looking for front-end developers with vanilla JavaScript and also with React, and also for full stacks, Java and JavaScript or JavaScript and PHP. So my colleague Victor will explain you about the technical part, what exactly does he do in his team, and you can ask us any questions you might have.
Well, so super briefing. See, at the end, what we are doing for these publishers is that we are optimizing the mobile version. Okay, sorry. What we do is we go to their page, we extract all the articles, and we create the Markfield version. And what we do is also trying to optimize all the first impression renderings or the server-side renderings that we can do. And also what we do is like optimize the engagement about the ads. We have also like server-side Preview in order to get the most revenue possible for the ads, and also manage the positions to have some kind of balance about the user experience and also the revenue that the publisher gets from their user visitors page. Yeah.
Is there any questions you want to ask? Are you looking for another new job?
Questions or not?
Are you want to work in this offices? So just to let you know,
I want to
those
work
are-
in these offices.
these are amazing.
Rockets, yeah. You
Oh,
can
yeah.
take them home. So you can see our email. Okay, it's also written in the cards. In case you have any questions, you can drop us an email. And this let me show you how to use. I
Yeah.
will try for you, okay?
So if you don't like the workshop, just throw it to Nader. That's it.
Any questions? Okay, maybe later.
Yeah.
We'll be here.
Yeah, I'm gonna be here.
Okay, so we'll leave it to you guys.
Thank you very much.
The important thing is that we have beer. Then after the meeting, there is a free beer for everyone who can or who wants to join.
Nice.
Cool. Thank you.
Awesome. And I think we're gonna have pizza also too. So yeah, that's great. Thanks, Marfil, again. This is great. Yeah, it's just making us be comfortable learning. So that's really good. Also, well, React.js Academy. I work for this company. We do trainings, private and public trainings. I don't know if you know React.js Academy before. No one? Great. So we do, essentially we do React trainings, and we are starting doing React Native trainings. So here is just, well, we announced it like a couple of weeks ago, but we're having a one-day training of React Native, a foundation training on March 19th. And it's over there in the website, so you can see the curriculum, what you're gonna learn. We're gonna talk about React Native, what it is, how the foundation of React Native. Also, we're gonna talk about navigation. It's a pretty important part of React Native. And then a little bit of animation. So that's gonna be covered in a whole day. Really excited and amazing. So all the information is over there, and we've been asking for your email when you came in here. That's because we're gonna raffle 3 tickets for this training, maybe tomorrow. So also for the live stream, we're gonna put a link over there. If you have friends, also you can send it to your friends. We're gonna do the raffle tomorrow for 3 people, so they can come for free to the training. So that's also great. And also I think we're gonna give you a discount for the other trainings that we have. You can choose whatever you want. I think for the bootcamp, for the next bootcamp or something. And also we're gonna have we have different formats for our trainings. One is the bootcamp. It's just 1 week, 7 days, intense about React, Redux, GraphQL, and advanced patterns about React. And the next one, I think, is going to be in Lisbon. But we're going to also open a new format here in Barcelona that is a part-time. So it's going to be 4 Saturdays, the whole day, learning about React. And it's going to be here also hosted. So that's going to be amazing. And it's going to start in March 23rd. So if you have any questions or whatever, just let us know. And yeah, I think with that, I can just introduce Nader. He's been working for AWS for the last year, I guess, yeah. And he's been doing developer advocate for all the tooling and everything related to AWS, Amplify, and everything that we're going to learn today. So without further ado, Nader, it's all yours. Thank you.
Thank you. So, yeah, my name is Nader David. I've been with AWS for about 1 year. Before that, I was actually doing this similar thing that Horacio was doing training. So I have a company called React Native Training that I no longer really do training for, but I did for a couple of years. I authored a book called React Native in Action about naming publications. and I run the React Native Radio podcast. If you're interested in listening to podcasts, we have about 120 or so episodes. But most recently, I joined AWS to work on the team that's building developer tooling for front-end and mobile developers. So traditionally, AWS is kind of known for back-end development, but we're starting to get into more tooling, and we're enabling front-end developers and mobile developers to kind of move further up the stack using their existing skill set. And that's what we're going to kind of go over today. So the two main things to keep in mind about what we're going to work on today is, number one, these are workshop GitHub repos. So if you don't follow along, or if you get behind, or if there's any issues with you keeping up, these are actually step-by-step repos that you can actually go through and finish at another time. They're also updated continuously. So if I do another workshop in the future, you might check my GitHub repo, and I might have added things to this repo, or might have added new workshops there as well. So this is kind of a continuous learning process. Is my main point. And then the second thing is the first repo up there that I have written there. First of all, if you want to get these repos, you need to go to my GitHub repo or the AWS repo and reference them there, or you can go to Twitter. I've written my Twitter name, Dabbit3. I just tweeted out the two links to those. Those are going to be the two workshops that we're going to be working with. So the first link is the actual workshop that we're going to be using to do an introduction to the tooling that we're going to be using. It is kind of an introductory level step-by-step tutorial to show you how to create authentication, to show you how to create a GraphQL API, to show you how to kind of just really get started with Amplify and AppSync. And then the second repo is actually the main application that we're going to be running and looking at. It's going to be the more sophisticated real-time offline ready application. So the way this is going to kind of work is we're going to walk through the initial workshop and kind of build out each of these features individually without writing a lot of UI code, but more just actually writing functional and logic and stuff like that code. And then after we kind of get comfortable with that, we'll switch over to the chat repo and clone it. And then we'll add the services that we need to get that working. So before we get going, who here has used AWS in general before? Okay. Who has used AppSync before? And who has used Amplify? Okay, cool. So
who's using GraphQL and knows what GraphQL is? Nice. That's good. That's good.
So I'm going to do a really quick review slide deck, but we don't really have a whole lot of time, so this is going to be kind of quick. Can I use the HTML? Or is there an HTML?
Is there an HTML?
No. Sorry.
Here. Let me see how far that goes.
Sure. I can actually go over this while they're looking for that. The two tools that we're going to be using with that are AWS specific for this workshop are AWS Amplify and AWS AppSync. AWS Amplify is essentially a CLI and a client library. The CLI is something like Rails for serverless services, or Rails for kind of like cloud computing services you could think of. So from the command line, you would spin up like an authentication service or a GraphQL API. And then the client library allows you to connect to the actual service that you created with the CLI. So we have JavaScript framework-specific components that you can use to connect to and interact with these different services. So we support React, React Native, Vue, Angular, Ionic, but we also support just general JavaScript APIs. And then we also have support for native iOS and native Android. So that's Amplify. And then AppSync is a managed GraphQL service. So if you've ever used something like Firebase, a lot of people compare that to AppSync. With AppSync, you have a GraphQL interface into any data source that you like. So a lot of people use a combination of data sources in their applications. Thank you. So there's my Twitter account if you want to. The very last tweet has the 2 links to the workshop. But AppSync allows you to connect to any data source that you like. So a lot of people have a single API with maybe a NoSQL database, also a relational database, maybe even a couple of Lambda functions. But it all kind of goes through that main GraphQL API gateway or interface. And those are the things that we're going to be using. So before we get started, who here doesn't have an AWS account yet? Does anyone not have one? Okay. If you don't have one, I'd go ahead and sign up because we're going to be needing that to keep going. Does anyone have any questions before we get started?
Yeah, I got a question.
Yes.
Is there Wi-Fi? I cannot connect.
I cannot connect.
So you cannot connect to Marfil guests.
No.
No way to connect to Marfil
So
guests.
the password is
Yeah. So go to Marfil.
Yeah.
And the password. Sorry, but
Is-
yeah.
you know it, right?
Yeah. So
I'll
the
give everyone a
password
couple
is lowercase Marfil rocks exclamation point.
Okay, cool.
Okay.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for asking that. That's gonna be a huge thing that you need to use. So yeah, that's needed. So.
Yeah, also brought stickers and so did everyone else. This is the Amplify logo. You haven't seen it. The OutSync logo is that little circle. And then I printed out my friend's tweet. This one here for all of us like college dropouts. So I mean, either way, it's so I'll give everyone a couple of minutes to get connected. The way that the first repo is structured, you don't need to really clone it. It's just more of a step-by-step guide. The second repo, you will end up cloning that. So just let you know that.
Just ask questions. Let us know if everything is working or not. That's helpful for us too. So. I'm just gonna double check that the audio is good.
Mi internet.
No,
Si no, Marfil Devices es lo mismo.
You repeat the password?
Marfil rocks. I'm gonna put it over there. Marfil rocks exclamation point.
Oh, yes, yeah, it works. ¿Sí?
Yeah, sure. Okay, yeah. Here. No. No. Lo están haciendo. There's a password, Wi-Fi password for Marfil. The network is Marfil. Okay. Cool.
When do we need to put the code? In a
So if you go to the GitHub repo, the first one, you'll see a redeeming the AWS credit right here. This will walk you through redeeming the credit. Okay, so the reason that you're getting a credit is if you're an existing AWS account holder and you've had it for more than a year, you may incur 50 cents, 25 cents today. But so this is to cover anyone that's been with AWS for a year. If you're a new customer though, like if you just signed up for this workshop or something, you have an entire year of what's called the free tier, which means you have like a pretty large amount of bandwidth before you get charged anything. So you're not going to have to worry about anything, but you can still use the credit, apply it to your account if you ever want to use it down the road. But if you're an existing user, this $20 credit will pretty much just give you a lot of room to play around with.
Yeah, $20 is a lot.
Yeah. But
No.
AWS will go a
Yeah.
long way. This will like last you production application for like a month or two or something. Yeah. So go ahead, redeem your credit if you'd like. And then we're going to start off on the getting started step in just a moment. What we're going to do is we're going to first create a React application. Within that React application, we're going to initialize a new Amplify project. Within that Amplify project, we're going to add two features. The first feature is authentication. The second feature is a GraphQL API. The type of application we're going to be building for this demo is going to be a Meetup app or a conference app where you can have a conference or a Meetup speaker with a talk name, a talk description, and information about the speaker. We're going to add a couple of features to that API from there. It's going to be a GraphQL API, you're going to be able to create and read from the back end. And then we're also going to add a subscription or real-time capability to it. So if a new talk gets added, your application updates in real time without having to refresh. And we'll do that using GraphQL subscriptions. And that's going to be kind of it. And then when we move to the chat app, that's going to actually have the offline functionality kind of built in, and we're going to walk through that and see what that looks like. So who here has used React Apollo or Apollo in general? Okay. So AppSync has two different GraphQL clients. A lot of people are used to working with Apollo. So we have the AppSync JavaScript SDK, which is a fork of the Apollo client, and it works with React Apollo. So if you've ever used that, that's what we implement in the actual chat app. The app that we're looking at now, that we're going to implement now, we're using the other GraphQL client, and that's coming off of the Amplify library. So we have two clients. One is to support people that like the Apollo client are used to using it. The other is just straight up part of the Amplify library, and it has more of a restful approach of GraphQL calls. I wouldn't say restful approach. I would say more like the traditional fetch approach or Axios, where you make an async call and you wait for the data to come back. Versus with Apollo, you're using things like higher order components a lot of times, or you're using what are those render props now. And if I'm going too slow or going too fast, well, if I'm going too slow, feel free to jump ahead. If I'm going too fast, let me know and I'll try to slow down. And again, you can take this workshop home and finish it and reach out to me on Twitter, like later on if you do that and you have any questions. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. The first thing I'm going to do is create a new React app using Create React App. I'm going to use npx because these days you don't really have to actually install the global. You can just run npx Create React App, which is pretty cool. That's what I like to do. So I'm going to do that. And I need to increase my font size. So let me do that. Is that font size, is that big enough for everyone to read in the back? Yeah. All right, so I'm going to do npx Create React App. You can call it whatever you want. Call it My Amplify. This water.
Yeah, it's for you.
Okay. Thanks.
Who's using React Native in their work? No? Who wants to use React Native? Nice. Nice. That's good. Yeah. Oh, I also asked about GraphQL. Who knows GraphQL? Like everyone. But who's using GraphQL in production right now? Nice. That's really good. Awesome. Me too. Yeah. Great.
All right, so after you install the or create the new application, we're going to scroll down and we're going to install two libraries. The two libraries that we're going to install are AWS Amplify and AWS Amplify React. AWS Amplify holds all of the JavaScript classes, all of the JavaScript functions that you're going to really need to build anything. The Amplify React library has pre-configured, pre-built UI components. We also have, again, Amplify React Native and Amplify Vue if anyone else is interested in those technologies. They all have the same component pre-built in. So we're going to go ahead and install those, and we'll use those in just a moment. And I'm using Yarn because it's faster.
So we're following.
Yeah, does anyone have any questions? I know we haven't really done anything yet. But
No.
all right, so after we install the libraries, we'll just continue on. And I think he already sent out the link for installing the CLI. But if you haven't installed the CLI, you need to go ahead and install that now by running npm install -g at aws-amplify/CLI, just like this. And then after you install the CLI, we're going to run amplify configure. You may have already done this already as well if he sent you the video and you got a chance to walk through that. If not, let me go ahead and walk through that again for anyone that hasn't done that yet. So after you install the CLI, we're going to run amplify configure. When you are using the CLI, like I mentioned, you're basically creating different services in your AWS account. So you're like creating APIs and backends and databases, all kinds of stuff. So it's kind of powerful. And because it's allowing you to do that, you have to associate the current user with an actual user in your account. So when we run amplify configure, we're able to do that. So what we're going to do with amplify configure is we're going to create a new user in the actual AWS account. We're going to take those credentials and save those locally into a config on our CLI, and then we can kind of use that user in the future. So after you run amplify configure, it's going to basically pop open the AWS dashboard just like this. We'll hop back over to the CLI. We'll choose the region that we'd like to create this user in. And this is going to be where these resources also get created from the CLI. So for where we are now, you might choose EU Central is Frankfurt. I'm not sure where EU West 1 is. I think that might be like Ireland or something. So let's choose either EU Central 1 or EU West 1. You could really choose any, but I'm just going to choose one of those. So for the name of the user, you can give this whatever you'd like. I think I have some example name here that I'm going to use, Amplify Workshop User, just to kind of stay along the same lines as the actual workshop. So I'll use Amplify Workshop User. Once you hit enter, this is going to open the dashboard again in the AWS console. And it's going to go ahead and automatically fill in the username for you based on what we just used there. So you see we have Amplify Workshop User. It'll also choose some settings for you. So when you create a user, you can either give it programmatic access, console access, or both. When you're logged into the actual AWS dashboard like we are now, that means we have console access. We can view the console. If you have programmatic access, you're basically saying that this user can create and do things in your account from different APIs, but can't do that through the console. So you can give one or the other or both. I'm just going to leave it with only programmatic access. And then from here, it's going to automatically choose administrator access. This just gives it full permissions to create anything. And because the CLI does a bunch of stuff, you need quite a few permissions. So this is kind of a good beginning blanket policy to let you do whatever you like. And then now you can review that, which I'll just go ahead and skip the tags, which we don't really need these. And then finally, we'll click Create User. And this will give us our two values that we're going to need. The access key ID, which we can reference at any time later on, but the secret access key is only given to us just this once. So once you save this, you can't go back and retrieve it again. You end up having to create a new user in the future if you lose this. So a lot of people will sometimes maybe download the CSV if they really need a reference to it later. But when we configure this, this will be available from the CLI anyway. So you just won't be able to access it from the dashboard. So I'll copy the access key ID, and here it's going to prompt us to put that in. So you just paste that here, and then you hit enter, and then the same thing with the secret access key. So we'll just copy that, paste that there, and then keep going. You can give this a name of whatever you like to reference later locally from the CLI. So the name of the user in the actual account is Amplify Workshop user. You can give it a different name if you'd like to locally to reference it from the CLI. I'll do the same name just so I can kind of understand that they are correlated in some way. And then after you give it a profile name, then it should go ahead and tell you that the user is successfully set up. And then from there, we should be able to start initializing new projects. Does anyone have any questions so far? Any issues with that? All right, cool. So now that we have that out of the way, we'll jump back to the workshop. And here we'll be able to kind of see everything that we went over right here. But now we're going to be into this step where we're initializing a new project. So Amplify Init creates a new blank Amplify project. And it'll walk you through a couple of different steps. It'll ask you for the name of the project, which will be referenceable within the app later. It'll ask you for an environment name because you can actually create multiple environments using from a single application. So for instance, you might have a prod environment or a dev environment, and then you want to create a new feature, but you don't want to test it out on your actual production environment. You can then spin up a new environment using the existing environment. So that's why we have the environment names. And then it'll ask you for your default text editor and a bunch of questions after that should be automatically populated for you based on the application that you're in. So if you're in a React application, we know that the source directory is src and the distribution directory is build. If you're in a Vue project, it'll be different. If you're in an Angular project, it'll also be different. So I'm just going to run Amplify Init and walk through these steps. Project name, I'll just let me check what we did here. I'll just copy whatever we have in the workshop, Amplify React app. I'm just taking all the defaults. And now it's going to ask us if we would like to use an AWS profile. This way, we can actually use the profile we just created a second ago. So I'm going to use the Amplify Workshop user that we just created, which is, it'll prompt you with all the different ones available. And that's it. This should go ahead and kick off a new Amplify project. This might take a couple of seconds. Does anyone have any questions while this is working?
In the permissions, we only need the administrator, right?
Yep. Yeah, the console is downloaded. Yes, sir. Yeah, he was asking about the administrating permissions. If you need only administrative permissions or the console, just
yeah, just programmatic access.
Just programmatic access.
Yeah, that's it.
I got an error.
Sure. Let me check it out.
Maybe I should say to the right.
Is that from Amplify Init?
Sorry?
That was from the Amplify Init command?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's cool. It doesn't. You gave that one administrator access and all that stuff. That user. Oh, nice. Okay, I was wondering, was worried.
Maybe it's
It's probably a bug or something in the CloudFormation. Anyone have any questions or any issues? Yes. Quick, man. Colon. Actually, I didn't do it on this.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's go. It has something to do with
No. I know, I can. Yeah. I'm currently in a company called Devex.
You have your building up.
It's a media company.
Oh, that's what it is. Yeah, we get that.
It's me. It's kind of like a
Yeah. Sorry about that. If you want another credit, I can Or one more. Do you have another credit? Or here they are.
Yeah. Sure.
Thank you. Here you go. Sure.
That
That shouldn't take long to catch up, so I'm gonna keep on going. I think. All right, so the next thing we'll do is we will go ahead and jump to the next step. So after we've initialized a project, you can now do a couple of things. We can add features, we can remove features if we already have them. We can also run amplify status to kind of see what's going on in the app. So let's just run the amplify command, and then you can kind of see all the different options. So if you just run amplify, you'll see that we have all the different commands available for the CLI. The ones that we're going to be working with are init, which we've already done. We're going to be running amplify add. We're going to be running amplify push. And if you'd like to work with multiple environments, we have a section that's in the workshop that will allow you to do that, and you'll be working with amplify env. So env is for environment. But what we'd like to do is we'd like to add a new category, and we want to add an authentication service. But before we do that, let's run amplify status. Amplify status will show the state of the local resources that are not yet pushed to the cloud. So this just kind of gives you an idea of how your application is looking currently. And right now, we don't have anything to show because we haven't added any features, we haven't updated or done anything really. So once we start adding different things, the category name will be populated with the resource name, the operation, which will be what the CLI is going to do next. So it'll be either create, update, or delete. So let's go ahead and add the authentication. So under the next step, you'll see headline of adding authentication. To do so, we'll run amplify add auth. And this will prompt us with two different options. So let's check that out. Amplify add auth. we can either choose a set of smart defaults or we can walk through our own configuration. When you're setting up authentication, you typically have requirements or concerns that you need to account for. So normally what that would look like would be like you need to capture metadata from the user. So you might need their address or you might need their favorite ice cream flavor or something like that. Who knows? You might also want to set up multi-factor authentication on sign-in, for example. And you might want to say that MFA type needs to be phone number versus email, or you might need it to be, you might want to set time-based one-time password as the MFA type. So if you would like to set up a custom configuration, you would choose no here and kind of walk through the steps. But if you choose the default configuration, which we're going to do for this workshop, it actually just kind of gives you a set of smart defaults. So the smart defaults will be this. When you sign the user up, you can capture their email, or you have to capture their email, their username, and their password. And then when they sign in, and also the sign up is MFA, so multi-factor authentication on sign up. And then when they sign in, all they need is their username and their password. There's no MFA on that. So it's kind of like a basic sign up flow that you might see. So for this example, we're going to choose yes for the default, but down the road, if you'd like to set something up custom, you can choose no. It'll ask you a bunch of questions. And with the MFA, you're going to have like an email or a text message come to you. You can actually set up how that text message, that email looks, like what the actual message says and the subject line and all that stuff. So anyway, after you run amplify add auth, that will go ahead and create a local authentication configuration locally. Now, if we run amplify status again, you should see a new category added and the operation set to create. This just means that if we run amplify push, the next operation that's going to happen is create, because we haven't not yet created this service yet. But before we do that, well, actually, let's go ahead and do that. Just run amplify push. This will ask us if we're sure we want to do this. Are we sure we would like to continue? We'll just choose yes. And this will start creating the actual service in our account. Now, the authentication service that we're using is something called Cognito and Cognito user pools. So I'm going to click on the link in the workshop to kind of like take a quick look at that while that's getting up to speed. This is the dashboard for what that looks like if you were actually going to log in from the AWS dashboard. And right here, you'll see two different types of user management. You'll see user pools and identity pools. We're going to be working with user pools. A user pool, you could think of a user pool as like a user group, or almost as like an application set of users. So using this user pool, you can actually sign up users and sign in users from a bunch of different applications. So the cool thing about user pools is if you have a mobile app and you have a web app and you have an Apple Watch app or whatever, you want someone to be able to sign in and access their identity across multiple devices, across multiple platforms. You can kind of do that using this. So after this is created, you should be able to kind of like refresh and see that you have a user pool in your account. We're going to be really working from the dashboard. It's just cool to know that it's here. And if you click on the user pool, you can actually see and change some of the settings. And you can actually see a list of the users by clicking users and groups. So once people start signing up, you can kind of see their metadata. Any questions?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, is the live streaming?
Yeah. I actually don't know. There you go. Thank you. This is like a new link. There were people in the old one, so I just sent everyone to it.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah. There are not too much people, but there are some.
So we're waiting for this to finish creating. But while that's happening, we can actually jump back into our code or jump into the code for the first time. And we're going to continue on right here where it says configuring the React application. So we have created a React app. We've created an Amplify project within that app, and we've installed a couple of libraries. We've installed AWS Amplify React, and then we've initialized a new service within our Amplify app. We've initialized authentication. The next thing we need to do is we need to write some code to let our React app know about the Amplify resources. So I'm going to go here and just go ahead and open up this application in my text editor. I'm going to be using VS Code. And the first thing you might notice when you look into your app is you have a couple of new resources. The first thing that you'll see is this AWS-exports.js file. This is completely managed for you by the CLI. You never need to change this or update it. It's just a reference of the location of the resources. So the location of your Cognito identity pool is this EU Central 1 : then the ID of the resource. You have a couple of other pieces of information like your stuff. But as you create, update, and delete things in your account, this will be automatically updated for you. So no need to even really ever change that, but it's good to know that it's there. And then in the Amplify folder, we'll see that we have two main folders. We have backend and current cloud backend. The difference is the backend folder is going to hold all of the current stuff that we're working with. So as we add stuff locally, before we push it up to our account, this backend folder will update. Once we've actually pushed our resources up to our account and that is successful, then our local project will sync with our cloud account and update this current cloud backend. That way we have two sets of resources. One is what's currently live in our app, in our account, and the other is like what we're currently like developing on. So the back end is what you're developing on. The current cloud backend is what's actually deployed. You never really touch that current cloud backend. You only work within the backend folder, and you only really work in that backend folder for certain things. So we're not going to really be touching that right now. But just to let you know, both the Amplify folder and the AWS exports file are kind of created and sometimes updated for you by the CLI. So now that we've created the service, this should give you this message that says all resources are updated in the cloud. You should be able to now open up index.js. And this is where we're going to configure our application to recognize this AWS exports file. So the way that we do that is if you go to the project, you'll see that we have these 3 lines of code. You can just copy and paste these directly in your index.js under the last import. So under the service worker, before the render, you can go ahead and import Amplify. You can import this configuration from AWS exports, and then you call amplify.configure, passing into configuration. We do this at a root level, which is in React index.js, and it only has to be done once. We can close this file and never kind of look at it again. This is just giving the project a reference to all of our resources. So in the future, when we use the Amplify APIs, we'll have a reference to all of our configuration. So once that's done, you can close index.js and move on to this next step, which is using the with authenticator component. So there are 2 main ways to work with authentication in Amplify. One is using the auth class, which I'm highlighting right here. You can import auth directly, and there are over 30 different methods on auth that you can call for user management to have fine-grained control over your user management. So you can do things like auth.signin, auth.signup, auth.forgotpassword, auth.whatever. Think of anything that you might need in a regular app, like resend MFA code. All that stuff is pretty much all available from that class. So you have full control over your authentication using that. But we also have these higher order components, I guess you'd call them, and with authenticator is an HOC. but they're more like higher level components that scaffold out a bunch of different functionality for you. So we have one for authentication, we have one for chatbots, we have one for working with S3 and images and photos and photo buckets and stuff like that. The with authenticator is what we're going to use now, though, and this allows us to put an entire authentication flow in front of any component that we'd like to authenticate. So our only component in our app right now is the app component. So we're going to protect our app with this with authenticator, and we can do that with just 2 lines of code. We'll first import the with authenticator at the top of our app.js file. So I'll open app.js, and underneath app.css, we'll go ahead and import that here. And then the last thing that we'll need to do is, instead of the default export being the app component, we're going to change the default export to be this with authenticator. So that goes away. We replace it with this. With authenticator takes in 2 arguments. The first argument is necessary, and the second argument is optional. The first argument is going to be the component that you like to authenticate. For us, it's app. The second is a configuration object that's optional. Here you can specify styling, you can specify theming, and you can specify things like what components you would like to render in this authentication flow. By default, we have like a yellow design as a theme, and we give the user a username, email, password, and phone number when they sign up, and then to sign in, username and password. Now you can change that if you like, but that's kind of how we're going to be working with starting off. So once you save that, we should be able to go ahead and run the app and see our first functionality, I guess you'd say. So what we're going to do is run npm start. And this should go ahead and open the app. And this is what you should see if everything worked right. Is like this sign up form. And if you want to test this out, go ahead and click create an account. Make sure you use your real email, because you'll be getting an email with your multi-factor authentication code, MFA code. It doesn't matter about the phone number. We're not using that right now.
I guess you can set up that in your Cognito user pool to use the phone, or
right. You can use, yeah, for MFA you can use either or. They're both set up first class, yeah. By default, using the configuration we use, it just sets it as email.
Sets it in. Okay.
So click create account and then check your email. Should have a verification code. Should look like that. And then after that, you should be able to sign in. So to sign in, just of course use your username and your password that you used earlier. And then if you're successful, you should see this. The second argument that we passed in the with authenticator was this includes greetings configuration. That's what gave us this this bar at the top with the sign out button. If you wanted to create that, only have the username, email, and password and phone number of the signed in user. But if you had other metadata, you could retrieve it this way. So what we'll do is we'll import auth from AWS Amplify, and then in component did mount, we'll call a method on auth. And the method that we're going to call is current authenticated user. This gives us literally everything that we possibly could get about this user. There are more fine-grained ways to get information. So you can call methods to get just their metadata. You can call different methods to get different other smaller pieces of information. But this kind of is just a comprehensive call that gets everything. So let's take a look at what that returns. So I'll go ahead and import auth from AWS Amplify. And then in component did mounts, we'll call this auth.current authenticated user method. This is a promise, so you can either do async await or you can just call .then. And I'm going to log out the entire, I just log out the entire user object actually. And then in the documentation I have, I'm also logging out the sign-in user session payload, because this is actually the information that you would probably want to use. And then there's also the user.username, but I'll just go ahead and log out the user because this will show everything. So if I refresh, you'll see that you should have your information logged. So the user info, this is what comes out of the payload. This has their email, their phone number, and their username. If you log out the entire user object, you'll see that we have a bunch of other stuff, including information, their attributes, which has just their metadata. A bunch of stuff that you probably won't ever need. But if you do need it, it's there.
Sorry, did you say you can expire the sessions through the control panel in the cockpit?
I'm not sure if you can do it through the panel, but you can expire them locally from your client application, I think.
Okay, but not on the AWS.
I'm not sure if you can or not. I'm not sure the answer to that. I can check on that. Yeah. Would you? Is that something you would want? Yeah.
Maybe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So now that's like the first part. So I might take a quick break and see if anyone has any questions or anyone has any blocking issues.
So in just 40 minutes, we had a React application with authentication.
Yeah, pretty much.
That's like,
yeah.
One thing about the payload, I think that reminds me a lot about JWT, like JWT. So it's maybe the payload that is stored in JWT or something like that.
Yeah, it is. Here, let's take a look.
So you just like export it for me also.
Yeah.
Over there.
Well, we end up using this in the Amplify client, under the behind the scenes, under the hood, just to send signed requests to API calls. So if you call AppSync, you'll be able to just call it directly without having to actually set any headers or anything. Mm-hmm. And then all of the claims will be available in the API. So you'll have in the context, you'll have an identity object that contains the decoded claims.
The decoded claims.
Yeah. So
that's good.
But if you did have an API that you were using that wasn't AWS, you would have all that information that you could send. So.
Yeah, you have that in a token. You need to decrypt the token to get the payload.
Mm-hmm.
That's good. Any questions, guys? Nader is here. It's the time to ask questions.
All right, so I think we'll get to the next part, which is why most of the people here is for the GraphQL. I'm going to skip over the custom authentication strategies for now because we're kind of running low on time already. I don't want to go over anything that's not too necessary. But this section just kind of shows you how you might create your own authentication flow. So what you might do would you would create some type of local state to hold username, password information, etc. And then you would, of course, just have like a form like you normally would with an on-change handler to update the state. And then you would just use the auth class to call methods. Like here I have auth.signup. This is a real way to sign up users. You would just pass in the username, password, and then any additional information goes in this attributes object. And then this is a promise. After it succeeds, the user will be signed up and you'll be able to go in your user pools and you should be able to refresh. Of course, I haven't showed you this, but you'll see the user that we just signed up there. So if you're ever interested in custom authentication strategies, check out that section. But what we want to do is add the GraphQL API. So to do that, you can run amplify add API. So let's jump back to the app and continue there. So amplify add API. There's 3 different types of APIs that can be created from amplify. One is the app sync with GraphQL. The other 2 are REST APIs. So if you choose GraphQL, we're going to assume app sync. If you choose REST, we'll then walk you through a couple of different options. If you've ever wanted to get started with serverless functions, you can choose REST. You'll have 2 types of serverless functions you can create. One of them is a Lambda function running Express with API gateway. It's all kind of scaffolded out for you. Express is a Node.js framework, and you've probably used it if you've worked on the back end. If not, it's the most popular Node.js framework. So we pretty much just create all of the different services for you, and then we also scaffold out some code that kind of gets you started. So we just create the entire Express app. We create all the different routes, and then you can kind of go and update the routes. So if you want to play around with that in another time, choose REST, but we're going to choose GraphQL. And then for the API name, I'm just going to go into the workshop and make sure I go along with this so I don't mess anything up. So I'm going to choose GraphQL Meetup. For the authorization type, right now we have 2 types of authorization that we can choose. We can choose API key. This basically means your API is going to be open to the public with anyone who has its API key and sends it in the headers to your app, into your API. So this is kind of an unsecure, or I wouldn't say an unsecure way of doing it. It's more of like if you need an exposed API that you don't really care, you just want it public and you want everyone to access it, you would use API key. If you want something secure, you would choose Cognito User Pool. Cognito User Pool is what we created already in our first step. You can also choose OpenID Connect, which will allow you to choose to bring your own authentication provider. So if you're working with Firebase or Auth0 or Okta or whatever, or you have your own, you can use OpenID Connect. After you create the API, you can just go in the dashboard and choose that. So those are like the three main ones. If you choose API key, you don't have any identity information though about the user. So we're going to choose API key, and then we're going to later kind of change it to Cognito User Pool to kind of show off both. But with Cognito User Pool, I guess one of the main things is you have the API, it's up and running, but no one can access the API unless unless they're signed in. So a lot of APIs, a lot of customers that we work with require both authenticated and unauthenticated access. That would be something like a blog where you want the user to be able to read the posts, but you might not want them to be able to create a post unless they're signed in, or you might need their identity to access like their own posts, for example. You can do that by choosing Cognito User Pool, and then I have a GitHub repo, and there's a bunch of documentation around how to update that. It's kind of like a 5 or 6 step process, if not more right now. It's kind of a pain. Like when I say pain, it'll take like 10 or 15 minutes. We want to make it just really easy through the CLI. So it's not available through the CLI right now is what I'm trying to say. So if you need authenticated and unauthenticated access, you can do it, but it's not really supported yet. It will be soon. Anyway, we'll choose API key. Do we have an annotated GraphQL schema? If you do, you can just reference that location and choose yes, but we don't. We're going to choose no. And then we can have a guided schema creation. What the schema creation is, it's just going to prompt us for 3 separate boilerplates that we can kind of choose to start off with. So let's just choose yes. And we see that we have 2 options. One is single object with fields. This is going to be just a to-do with an ID, a name, and a description. You can also choose the one-to-many relationship, which will give you a boilerplate for a one-to-many relationship. If we had chosen an authentication type or an authorization type, we would have had a 3rd option for authorization and fine-grained access control. We're just going to choose single object with fields. And then we want to edit the schema, so choose yes here. And this should open this type of to-do in our app. If it didn't open that there for you, this. So just copy that, and we'll save that. The main difference from a traditional GraphQL schema that you might notice is that we have this @model decorator. Typically, when you create a GraphQL API, you typically create the main type, the base type. Then you'll probably create different operations on the type. So you'll probably have create, update, delete. You'll probably have a list. You probably want to be able to pull like an array of these items out. You might have subscriptions, all that stuff. You also might want to create resolvers between the operations and the back end. And then you need the back end to begin with. When we used our decorators, that actually allows us to kind of like work at a higher level and scaffold out all that stuff based on industry standard requirements. So what we're doing with @model is when we add that decorator, we're saying we want all of the typical operations that come along with the type. So it's going to create all of the schema for mutations, queries, subscriptions. It's also going to create input types for us, all that stuff that we would probably write ourselves. It'll also create the resolvers between the operations and our data source, and it will create a NoSQL DynamoDB table data source for us. So with this single @model, it kind of does all that stuff. There are a bunch of other decorators that we have, or directives. We have @connection. This allows you to create relationships between different items. So if you have like a talk and maybe a speaker type, you can have a speaker with an array of talks and then create a relationship using that. We also have @auth that allows you to describe authentication rules around your API. We have a bunch of different ones. Actually, let me go ahead and to the amplified documentation and kind of go over those.
And is that per type or
Yeah,
per
type.
per attribute? Can you do
Oh,
that?
you can do attribute stuff too. Yeah.
Okay.
So it just depends on which it is.
Okay.
This model is a type field. So I'm going to go to API. Actually, here GraphQL transform. That's kind of what we're using is this GraphQL transform helper. So this is a bunch of documentation around it, but let's see here the other ones. So we have @model. We've already looked at that. I mentioned @auth, but let me find the ones that I haven't mentioned. @connection, I mentioned that one. That's for relationships. @version, if you would like to do versioning. @searchable, this is really cool. This actually takes your base type and creates a Elasticsearch setup for you, and then anything that's stored in your database gets streamed to the Elasticsearch API. So pretty much it kind of like has an additional data source added to it, and then you can query either from your DynamoDB table or your Elasticsearch. So it's pretty sweet. Let's see what else. I think there's maybe one or two more. I should remember these.
Yes.
Yeah, awesome.
And does it generate that access layer automatically for these models, or you have to implement the resolvers?
The resolvers are implemented for everything. Yeah.
Just need to connect the data source, right?
And
Yeah, it connects the data source. It creates the resolvers,
And then
all that stuff.
can you add like custom?
Yes, then you add custom stuff. So you can either do it locally after it's created. You can do it locally. I'll show you in just a moment, but you should have a resolvers. This directory will be populated in just a moment, and then you can just change the resolvers or add resolvers. There's quite a bit of documentation.
How do you integrate the generated thing with your thing?
The generated,
Generated access layer with custom business logic.
Oh, custom business logic. You would write it typically in GraphQL. You would write that in a resolver, or if it's really sophisticated stuff, you would do it in like you would have like a in between layer, maybe like a Lambda function. In AWS, you might use a Lambda function.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And you can use Lambda functions as data sources actually. So what you can do is what a lot of people do actually is you have at the resolver level, the resolver runs the executes a Lambda function pretty much. You can do stuff there and then come back. And there's also something called I don't want to go too deep into all this other stuff because there's a bunch of stuff that you can do with AppSync. It's pretty powerful. We have something called pipeline functions, which allow you to pipe a single request across multiple resolvers, and multiple data sources. So you have a one resolver that executes the request and response mapping template, passes that response to another resolver that executes a request and a response mapping template, keeps going on until you return from the actual. So you end up being able to hit up, say, for instance, you wanted to go to Elasticsearch, query something, take the result from that, query something from a SQL database, take the result from that, pass it on to a Lambda function. Like you could do all of that stuff within a single request. So it's pretty cool. Anyway, so that's where you would set up all that stuff. You would add all the different add all the different directives. We're just adding a pretty basic thing. So we're going to go ahead and save this, and we'll jump back to the command line and then hit enter. And then that should be really about it.
It's gonna create everything.
So another one question. So what you are doing actually is that you are defining your GraphQL type definition, and from there you are gonna auto-generate a lot of stuff. Right?
With at model, yeah, we are. But you could also define all that stuff yourself if you'd like.
Could you like split the type definition in the GraphQL from the GraphQL scheme, or you have to implementing the .GraphQL file?
You can either have it all in a single file, or you can have it across multiple files, and then we compile it for you. It's not really schema stitching, but it's just schema separation.
Yeah.
So after you add that, you can then run amplify push, and this will create the API. This is again going to prompt us if we'd like to continue. We'll choose yes.
Yeah, this will create the API because you add the API to your project. You create the type definition, and now you're pushing.
Yeah, we only created the configuration locally. We pretty much AWS has this idea of like CloudFormation, which is it's kind of like people say infrastructure as code. You define like different resources. You're like, okay, I want a database, I want an API gateway, I want an AppSync endpoint. All that stuff is like in this huge file that we kind of do under the hood. And then when you run amplify push, you're like pushing that file into your account, and it processes it, creates all the infrastructure
everything
for you.
Nice.
So what's cool about this now is we added this feature recently that allows us to now, we're already generating all that code on the back end. We can also generate some code on the client. This is what you would do if you would like to do that. And I'm going to choose yes so we can show you how that works. But when you create your GraphQL API, not only do you have your operations in your schema, like your queries, mutations, and subscriptions, but you normally also have to create those locally to interact with the API, right? So we can generate those by just choosing yes. You can either choose JavaScript, TypeScript, or Flow. So I'm going to choose JavaScript. I'm not a big fan.
No. Why is that?
Everything I've learned about TypeScript, I've learned, against my will. So now we can choose the pattern for the file, because we're going to be basically creating a folder called GraphQL. We're creating this GraphQL folder. You can say where you'd like it to be. I'm just going to choose the default because we are working in the source directory, and it'll create the queries / queries.js and all that stuff. Anyway, I'm going to choose the default there. Whoops. Do we want to generate all of the possible operations? Choose yes, because that way you don't have to. It just chooses everything. Yeah. So
just do it.
Yeah. I mean, why not?
Yeah.
And then the maximum statement depth with GraphQL, we have a lot of security measures built in, but one thing you have to take into account is if you want to have some type of security around the depth of queries, because with GraphQL in general, you could have a situation where you have, for instance, maybe a book type that has an author, and then the author has an array of books, and then that book has an author and so on and so forth. So someone could launch a malicious attack by sending like 30 or 40 nested query, deep query. Anyway, so you can kind of set the limit here. We actually have also some limits set like for you. So we have things like timeouts and other stuff to prevent that. But if you'd like to kind of have more control over it, you can set a base level here, and then you can override this later. But I think 2 is between 2 and 5 seems to be a pretty good a good number to go. So I'm just going to choose the default, which is 2.
That's it. And you're creating a graph.
Yeah, this creates everything. So we'll wait, give this for a second, and then we'll go into the dashboard and kind of check it out and play around with it. So this has been around since April of 2018. So it launched in April. We have a bunch of production applications running on it now. A lot of our biggest customers, AWS, Ticketmaster has written quite a bit. I think they have some of the largest scale because they have like situations where they'll put tickets on sale, and they'll go from like 0 requests to like millions of requests, like within seconds. Because when tickets go on sale, they might get 1 million requests for 1,000 tickets. So they have to be able to handle that, and they're using AppSync to do a lot of their stuff to keep up with the real time stuff. So we've actually tested it across really large scale. Yeah, so it's production ready stuff, and it's also the type of stuff that just scales for you. So a lot of times you don't really have to worry about scalability when you're prototyping, but this allows you to prototype at scale pretty much. So like even though this only takes a few minutes to set up, it's also production ready. So
that's really cool.
So just wondering, are there more companies that they are using in production right now?
yeah, Aldo, BMW, Disney, they're all some of the customers. We have a bunch of customers that are not really available for us to talk about because they're either not, like, we have to get there's a lot of legal stuff that goes around with it. We're working on like our legal team, I think, or whoever's in charge is working on like a page that's going to show all of the customers that we have, because like people like to see that type of stuff.
Yeah, use cases.
Yeah.
They're pretty good. They're pretty important.
I mean, some of the customers of AWS in general are like our biggest customers are like Ticketmaster. I mentioned those, but actually like Netflix, Airbnb, the United States government, like a bunch of big customers.
Nice. Yeah, one of the things, like, we also do consulting, and we always try to sell like GraphQL because of all the benefits that you should know. And it's always a concern about scalability and performance and all those things, and we need to like address those things before and actually test it like first. And it's interesting how when you start talking about backend stuff like GraphQL and dealing with, okay, now you're gonna get access to whatever you want in this way, always backend developers are like, what the hell are you doing?
I mean, it's really not easy stuff.
I don't want the front-end developer to do that. Like, I want the control. And it takes time for people to understand, like, the control. You still have the control, but they do whatever they want.
I mean, the backend ends up getting more work, I think, when you do GraphQL, because a lot of the stuff that you might have done on the client, like filtering and stuff like that, you end up just not needing to do anymore. The backend developer now has to implement additional logic in their resolvers and stuff.
Yeah. Also, well, it's like a balance, because they get more work on those things, but they get less work when the company in the front end, the product team, they want to do testing. They want to test new things, different ways to.
Yeah, I mean, there's less endpoints too. I mean, that's the big thing for backend developers. Like for a single type, you might have needed to create 100 endpoints for, like, for instance, like the one that comes to mind is like if you have a user and you have an API call to fetch the user information, What if you only want their username and their password, but you also, in a separate API call, need their friends list, a separate call, you need their relatives, second.
Yeah.
I mean, you end up having 100 different endpoints, but with GraphQL, you have a single endpoint.
Just one single endpoint,
So,
get whatever you want, and
yeah.
that's it. Yeah, so it's interesting.
So if that worked properly, you should be able to see in the workshop, there's a link right here that says console.aws.amazon.com/appsync. This should take you to the AppSync dashboard, where you should see a list of the different APIs that are in your account. Make sure you're in the right region, because when you created your user earlier, you chose a region. If you chose EU Central, you're going to see Frankfurt. If you chose EU, like East or West, it might be Ireland or London. I use EU Central, so I'm in Frankfurt. So if you chose a different region, you might not see anything. It's my point. Questions? So click on the API that we've created, which should be GraphQL Meetup -environment name, which is dev for us. And then on the left-hand side, you'll see a bunch of different links and stuff. The place that will probably work next is the schema. This shows you the generated schema. I mentioned earlier that we only created that base type and we created additional schema for you. This is that schema that was created. So we create inputs for mutations. We create filters for filtering and searching. We create mutations. The 3 mutations that we create are create, update, and delete. We create 2 queries, one for getting a talk by ID and one for listing all of the talks. This would query the entire database and just pull back everything. This just gets a single item. We have subscriptions that are automatically created for you again. Subscriptions are typically created on some type of event. So we take that same approach and we create subscriptions around all of the different events, all the different mutation events. So on create, you can subscribe to on update, and you can subscribe to on delete. So all that stuff is created for you. Also on the right-hand side, you'll see that we have all the resolvers created for you. And if you click on data sources, you'll see that the data sources are created for you as well. And back in our project, if you go into the back-end resolvers, actually, it should be there. Let me try closing my project or something. I think I may have done something wrong when I deleted the, when I was creating my project, I left off something.
It's empty for me too.
What's that?
It's empty for me too.
Oh, really?
Yeah, in the source, in the front end is everything. So there is a GraphQL folder with.
Yeah, that's interesting. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, that's right. We moved. They changed it. We just released a new version of the CLI, and I'm not familiar with it, like the updates. So under build, you'll see the resolvers. If you want to create custom resolvers, that's where you put the resolvers in that resolvers directory, which is by default empty. Okay.
If you want to do your
another-
resolvers, you can
Yes.
do the resolver
Would you mind to
for-
change the
There's
field
a
to
build.
light color?
So
Yeah,
they
that's a
mix-
build.
Oh, yeah, is that too dark? Yeah.
they
Okay,
mix
okay.
both.
Yeah. Because I have been trying to paste.
Yeah, that's a
Now I
good idea.
understand your question. Yeah.
I think you can do like control.
Yeah.
Yeah, there and just thin and the light bars.
Yeah, I think that's better. So yeah. Anyway, so you should see that in the future, because I'm not. I'm cool with it because I understand it now. I spent like a couple hours reading through the documentation, and if you spend a couple of hours doing that, you should get up to date too. But the resolvers are written in something called VTL, which is Velocity Templating Language. It's something that's been around for a while. AWS already uses it in a bunch of places, so that's kind of why they chose it here. It's also very, very, very performant, and it just serves a really good use case. The problem is a lot of people aren't familiar with it yet, so it's kind of like just something you have to learn. The good thing is, if you want to learn how to do it, we have good documentation around it. Also, if you click on a resolver in your actual console, for instance, I'll look at the create talk resolver. You'll see that you have the resolver code written here in VTL. But you can actually get templates for doing common operations by just clicking in this drop-down menu. So if you want to like delete by an ID, if you want to list items, if you want to do a query based on some index, you pretty much have all that stuff scaffolded out. So you can kind of get started using those templates. But you'll notice, again, like in your project, if you look at your resolvers, they are written in VTL. So it's like the .VTL, whatever. So that's the one thing that's a learning curve, I would say, for sure. And I would like for us to be able to have those written in JavaScript or something. And that possibly could happen. But for right now, it's not the case.
Some hints over there.
So that's kind of what's going on there. Now, if you've ever worked with GraphQL, you're aware of the graphical editor. So if you click on queries, we have a graphical editor built in. So this is where you can start making requests against the API. And you'll see in the documentation that I have a couple of operations, mutation, query, and all that stuff. You can also click on the right-hand side under the docs, and this will be a documentation explorer. This kind of walks you through, thank you, all the different operations that are available. So if you want to know like what queries are available, you can click query. This is just a GraphQL thing more than anything, but we have it built in. So if you want to know what mutations are available, what inputs that takes, and whether or not they're required, you can kind of do all that there.
Is there a way to expose that GraphQL somewhere apart from this console?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay.
We're working on some stuff around local testing and stuff like that, and I think that will be part of it.
But the introspection is public, right?
Yes.
So you can spin another instance.
You can introspect from here, but not from your local
you need
console.
to log in to
Okay.
Amazon in order to do introspection.
Now in the actual query editor, you can do mutations. So I'll just do a create, and then from there we'd have autocomplete. So if you just type in whatever, oops.
But it is usually desirable to leave the introspection open or not. Well, maybe.
Depends on your team. Yeah, depends on who's in charge of this part, who's in charge of the front end. If there's a product team like it's huge, maybe they need introspection in order to make changes or test queries. Yeah.
So I'm going to go ahead and create a new item using this create talk mutation. I'm just going to like copy and paste this. You can write it yourself if you like. So after you create an item, whatever you return here should be, of course, what you see returned on the right-hand side. That's GraphQL. I know a lot of people here are familiar with GraphQL, but if you're not, we just made a mutation. There are two main operations, I guess, that you would say that are comparable to REST. Those are, with REST, you have GET requests. And in GraphQL, that would be a query. And then all the other operations, puts, delete, update, all that stuff is a mutation. So here we're doing a mutation. And then there's one other operation that's GraphQL. It's specific. It's a subscription. That's something like if you've ever built WebSockets, it's similar functionality, completely different, like actual, like, I wouldn't say completely different implementation, but the API is much different. Subscriptions have like their own defined way of doing things. All right, cool. So yeah, that's create. Now let's go ahead and query. So we'll do query of list talks, and we'll return an items array, and we'll just return, every item that's available. So that would be the ID, name, description, speaker name, and speaker bio. So now if we have multiple operations, when we click this button, we should see a couple of different things drop down. So I'll go ahead and do list talks. So now we have the list talks array coming back. And then the last thing we'll look at is we can do filtering. So this is kind of like a way to do search. This is a basic way to do search. This will get you, pretty far. If you need something more sophisticated, you might want to jump to Elasticsearch. But let's try to do a search. So to do that, I'll just pass in a filter argument here. And the filter that I'll use is the description. And then description has a couple of different things that we can do. So we can use all these different fields for the description for the filter. What I'm going to do is I think contains. Is that what we were going to do? Yeah, contains. So we're going to say if the field contains React, then that's what we want to filter on. So if I go ahead and do list talks again, that still comes back. But if I create a new mutation called view, and I put like view is awesome.
What? No one said anything.
There you go. So we create another talk. If we query our list again, we should see that only the React talk comes back because that's all we're querying for. But if we want to check for view, we could do that. So basically, it's kind of like a way to do search, basic way.
I'm not gonna say anything. Just JavaScript.
So now that we know that our API is actually up and running, let's connect our React app to it. So you can jump to the next step, which is interacting with the GraphQL API from our client application. I mentioned that we can use either the AppSync.js SDK, which is a fork of Apollo and the same API as Apollo, or we can use Amplify, which we're currently using now. I'm going to demo Amplify now, and then when we jump to the chat app next, that's going to be using Apollo. And I'll try to finish this up within the next 20 minutes so we can jump to the next part. All right. So in app.js, we'll go ahead and import two things, API and GraphQL operation from AWS Amplify. API is the client, and then GraphQL operation is very similar to GraphQL tag, if you ever use that. It basically takes a string and turns it into GraphQL, like readable AST. So if I go ahead and import that, jump back into my app, and app.js, we'll continue on. I might go ahead and delete this component div mount lifecycle method just to have a little less code. Is that too small there?
No.
There we go. That might help. So I'm going to go ahead and start at the top. I no longer need auth, really, so I'm just going to delete that, but you can do whatever you want. Anyway, so we want to import these two. We also want to import list talks from our queries. So in GraphQL, you should have the queries directory, the queries file there. And we're going to import from there. The next thing we'll do is we'll create some initial state. The only state that we're going to start off with is just an empty array of talks. And then we'll have the component div mount lifecycle method.
What? What are hooks?
Yeah, I know, right?
Hooks, yeah.
Goodness.
Hooks are deprecated. They're coming out with something new anyway. Like, seriously, that's probably going to happen.
Yeah.
React Comp 2019.
Yeah.
Hooks too.
So this is where all the action is going to happen in this component mount lifecycle method. We call our GraphQL API by just saying API.GraphQL. API has about 6 different methods on it, so you can kind of look at those if you have the AWS Amplify. What is this? The
extension.
Yeah, extension for VS Code, which you might want to get if you start playing around with this. We have these requests that can be used with REST APIs, and we also have the GraphQL one. So we're using the GraphQL one. So we call API.GraphQL. This takes one argument that's mandatory and one that's optional. The mandatory argument would be the operation that you want to do. So this could be a query, it could be a mutation, it could be whatever. And then if it is a mutation, then you probably need a second argument, which would be the properties that you're passing into the mutation. So a lot of times that would be a query with an ID or a mutation with an object. Anyway, so once that comes back in an asynchronous manner, we log it out, and then we call set state. So when the app loads, component to mount gets called, calls the API, updates the talks array. If that comes back successfully, if it doesn't, we just log out an error. And then finally, we have our UI. So this is just a really, really basic thing where we just map over the talks. You can just put that anywhere in your render method.
List talks, is that the query that you're doing? Can I see the definition of list talks?
Sure. So queries.
Okay, here it is.
List talks.
Just
This was generated by the CLI. If you didn't need the filters, you could just delete that. It doesn't really matter.
So Nader, I was wondering, you just said that you cannot introspect your schema from the internet if you are not logged in Amplify, right?
Yeah, if you're not logged in the AppSync console, you can't introspect.
So could you introspect your API from your editor?
Well, you could. I mean, if you look at the
I mean, like just
should be the type definition over there, yeah.
Yeah, if you look right here,
This is the schema.
we have the schema. So you could do that way. Actually, yeah, this is the schema, yeah.
So what I mean that, let's say that I have different like teams, right? So one team is working involving the API, and they are gonna push something to the production, right? So probably I wanna try to interpret to my production ready API with a URL, right? So could I do that from outside of from that console that you got in the AWS sync? Because let's say that I want to use the visual code station Apple in order to interpret my API and get interpretation result in my IDE. Could I do that? With, I don't know, probably some configuration, patching some headers or whatever?
I don't know. I'd have to check into that. But I know that what some people are doing is, or what a lot of people are doing is they're creating like environments for new features. And then that just basically allows you to have complete control over everything for that developer. And it doesn't affect their production environment.
Yeah.
So you basically, you have the main environment, you check out a new environment, you make changes, and then when you check back the original environment, you see a diff between the two. And then if you'd like to, you can merge the changes into your main environment. And if not, you can just delete the other environment.
Yeah, so I guess that
again.
you can provide some like permission to certain devices, certain people, right?
Yeah, you can do that. I would say that to get the best answer to that question though, if you put an issue on the Amplify CLI
Yeah, I think.
or the Amplify JS library, and then just let me know which one it is, and I'll try to show it to the team and get their opinion on that.
Sure.
So.
Thanks.
So now if you save that and refresh, you should see the data logged out, and then you should see the data also rendered to the screen. I need to run my. Looks like I have some type of error. For some reason, my AWS exports file didn't get updated. I think I saw some type of error when I did this earlier. I wonder if that's what it was.
Error must provide pattern.
Yeah, I think I know what happened. I actually deleted the folder location. I think it's threw something off. But anyway, I can fix that. I'm just going to go to the AppSync dashboard. And you can download the data from there directly.
There you go.
Yeah, I don't think this probably happened to anyone else because they didn't screw it up. I got it. Does anyone else have that issue? Oh, you do? Oh, really? Might be something. I need to bring it up to.
You want a rocket?
No. Did it do work for anyone else?
Yeah, for me it works.
It worked. It didn't work for you. Okay, I'll bring this issue up for sure. So yeah, so if you want to get the stuff that was created, just go to the dashboard, click on JavaScript, and that config. And then you can either, you're not really supposed to edit it, but you could just like copy and paste that stuff here. You could do that, or you could go into app.js. I'm sorry, you can go to index.js, and you could just define. You could just copy that there. What is it? And then
Spread.
Yeah, spread over those. This way you don't really have to worry about updating this one. So that's the fix if you have an issue. I ran this entire workshop like 7 times today and didn't have that issue. That tells you what happens when you do live coding. There's always something, always, man. Seriously. So anyway, so if you save that, it should work now. So when the talk data comes back, you have the object that contains the data, the list talks array, and the items. I'm sorry, the items array. And then you have like a next token. We have pagination built in. So you could ask for, you could pass in like different arguments to get the number that you want. And then you could do pagination using that next token if you like.
Using cursor based.
Yeah, cursor-based pagination. So now that we know how to do queries, let's jump to the next step for mutations. And we'll do that real quick. And then we'll look at subscriptions. So it's very similar to what we did earlier in the sense that we import the operation. We call the API using the API class. And that's kind of the main flow. You import the mutation, you make the call. And then, of course, with a mutation, we have a lot of other stuff going on too. You know, we keep up with the current state of the form and the state. We check a little bit of form validation, some really sophisticated form validation. We do an optimistic update by assuming that this is going to go through, and we just call set state before we even make the call. And then we do a try catch for the asynchronous call. And all this other stuff is pretty basic form stuff. So I'll go ahead and walk through this. So I'll go ahead and import this. I'll update the state to now have a little bit more fields. I'll create this create talk method. And I guess one thing to point out is earlier we called API.GraphQL passing in just the operation name. Here you see that we pass in that second argument. That's the mutation that we're sending up to our API. And then we have the onChange method that keeps up with the user's input. And then finally, we have the form. And this form is really, there's no styling because I'm trying to keep the verbosity, or like, you know, kind of not very verbose or whatever you would say.
Oh, who needs CSS? I'm joking, actually.
So yeah, put the form right above the array. So pretty basic stuff as far as the UI is concerned. And there we have a form. So let's go ahead and try this out. Set the speaker name. We click create talk. The UI should optimistically be updated because we're doing the call to set state. And then if that's successful, you should see item created. And then to test it out, just refresh, and you should see that now we get all 3 items back when we make the call.
Nice.
And then the last thing we'll do is we'll implement subscriptions. Any questions before we keep going on?
Yeah. Question. So could you show us where you are setting the GraphQL URL? Because I've seen in the code base that you have a file called like config. In the index.js in the client, you are setting introducing AWA amplify whatever, and then you are passing that URL. But I cannot find that file in the GitHub repo. So I guess that you have to have like a URL where you are passing on the client in the index.js, I guess.
Yeah, in that config, you should have the URL for the endpoint.
Could you show us what is it? And
yeah, so in the actual repo, like the credentials would be something you would store in your repo within an organization, but not in an open source project.
Yeah, sure. But I mean, like, for example, now if you can open the index.js, we should see how you are setting the GraphQL API URL, right? Because we have to fetch the data from somewhere.
Oh yeah, this is it right here.
So yeah, you got that. Okay, that's what.
This should have been updated in this AWS exports file. Something happened when I created my CLI. I think it had to do with my. It's a bug I have to report. I think it had to do with my file structure for my GraphQL locally, which doesn't make a lot of sense. But I think that's what messed it up.
So if you open that in the browser, what's
if you open that.
I don't think.
Actually, I don't think anything because
I think that's accept just post. If you open the browser, it's a get. So
you actually need the API key.
Okay.
Maybe.
Yeah, that makes sense.
If you post with Postman, right?
Oh, Postman. Well, yeah, you need the API key then.
Yeah, you can do a curl with the API key.
Yeah. So that okay now makes sense.
Yeah. All right, cool. So the last thing we'll do is subscriptions. And the way that we do subscriptions in AppSync is we have a very similar. Actually, this is only with Amplify. The AppSync SDK does it with higher order components and very similar to the Apollo. But what we're doing here is we're calling API.GraphQL just like we were before. But instead of it being an asynchronous like promise, we're actually calling .subscribe. So this .subscribe actually creates the connection, the subscription, and then every time a new event happens, this next function gets fired, and then the function gets passed in the event data. So you can create multiple subscriptions in an app because you probably need on update and on delete too if you wanted to keep the client up to date. But here's what we're doing: is just a basic on create subscription. We call .subscribe again every time a new item is created. This next function will fire with that new item. from there, it's up to us to update the data locally. So in our case, we just have a list of items. We just want to take that new data and update our list. The proper way to do this would be to have a client ID that's unique, that will be stored in the database, because what you have with subscriptions normally is you subscribe to changes to a piece of data, and then your other people that are connected subscribe to changes to that same data. But how does your client application know whether or not you were the one that created that data? Because the subscription is going to fire no matter what happens. The proper way to do that, again, is to probably create a unique client ID. So when the new piece of data comes down in the subscription, you can filter based on that unique client ID. But what we're doing here is we're filtering because we don't have that client ID. We could just create it in the schema, just by adding a new field. But anyway, we're just filtering based on the talk name and the talk description to make sure there's no duplicates. But again, the proper way would probably be doing a client ID. So we take the data, we create a new array, and we call set state. So let's go ahead and try this out. So in component did mount, we'll go ahead and set this up. I'll go ahead and save that, refresh. And we can test this out, I guess, a couple different ways. One way you could test it out is to open up 2 windows. And go to your editor here. So Angular, we're missing Angular talk.
And React.
For sure.
Horatio.
Yeah, I'm the framework guy.
Whatever you say.
Yeah.
So if we create this, then we should see the client update with the new data, if that works correctly. So there we go. So we created it. The subscription is working. We see that we have the event data come through once. And we actually used it because there was no duplicate data. And the objects that it contains kind of looks like this. If you want to look at it, it has a value, it has a data property as well as a symbol. And I wonder what that symbol is used for. I don't know. I wonder if we could use that in some way. Anyway, the onCreate talk is the the data that we're basically using. Yeah. So this was the subscription information. So we have all that stuff: speaker bio, speaker name, all that stuff.
Yeah, you are getting that through the event because in the return of the mutation, you are asking for that data.
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly,
It's not like the resource that is being created, you get everything.
So if we created the mutation with
you're asking line
if we
24.
only return the ID, then that event would only have the ID. Yeah.
Oh.
So it would be a breaking. It would not work. Mm-hmm. Let's try that out. Let's just ask for the name back. There we go. That's fine. So this should only bring back the ID and the name. So there you go. So there's no speaker name. There's no
that's the last one. The new one.
Yeah, the Angular 2. Yeah. All we got was the ID. So let's look at the data. The ID and the name, yeah. Of course you could create, through this, and it should come, the event data will come back. But the UI won't be updated because we're filtering. I mean, when I say it won't be updated, it'll only be updated once. The event data is now duplicate, so it filters it out. If we didn't have that filter check, it would show up twice. Whoa. I need to delay that meeting, huh? Let me just send a message real quick. Actually, I'll let me do that here.
Any questions about what been seeing? I think this is like the pre-session for seeing, like looking at the React Native.
Yeah, the chat
the chat
app is what we're
application.
doing next. Yeah.
Which database is used? Sync.
DynamoDB.
The one that we're using now is DynamoDB. So we support 5 different data sources, first class data sources, which we call them, which means that we have resolvers that have the different, metadata that's available to like make direct requests to these data sources in the resolver. So the first class ones that we were supported, DynamoDB, which is NoSQL. We have serverless Aurora, which is a SQL database. We also have Elasticsearch. We also have Lambda, which is just a Lambda function, which allows you to use any data source or any API or microservice. And then we have something called HTTP resolvers, which people use to port over REST APIs into their microservice architecture that is AppSync. So if you have a REST API, you can just like port it over, use the HTTP resolver, and then make GraphQL requests against your REST endpoint. And then the other one we have is actually called a none data source. So say you have a subscription on some data change, and you want to fire that subscription for some reason, and you don't want to actually make a change in your database, you can actually trigger that using a none data source. So we actually have 6 types of resolvers now. Yeah.
So another, do you happen to know if you guys are gonna try to support more data sources as Postgres, Mongo? Are there like some people working plugins?
Yeah, so like so the first class data sources that we support are going to be like AWS probably data sources, because when you do that, you end up having all of the security and stuff already like working for you. A lot of people are using Postgres and Mongo through Lambda, but I think we have a Postgres data source like in AWS, and we also have something that's like a MongoDB data source. We just got it. It's called DocumentDB, same exact API. We're adding data sources. I don't know which ones are coming next or when they're coming, but yeah, we're continually adding. We basically base it on customers that are like using our stuff already and have requests. And we balance that with feature requests from people that aren't customers. So if we have someone that's already using it and they will depend on it and they really need something, we'll probably prioritize that. And then we also take into consideration like other things. So if someone just has that feature request, we also take that into consideration. Yeah.
If I want to use AppSync as a gateway to my API or my like microservices, do I need to go and to use TPL? I don't remember the name of the resolver language.
Yeah, VTL.
VTL.
Oh no, you don't have to use VTL with Lambda. Use JavaScript.
Just JavaScript, and then call maybe a REST API.
Yeah. It's all like with VTL. I mean, with Lambda, it actually is the easiest way to just write your resolvers in JavaScript, and it's really nice. Actually,
you would do it with Apollo or with.
You would write your client code with Apollo. You could write a server in Apollo if you wanted to. Yeah. But yeah, you could totally do that. Yeah, in the Lambda function. Yeah, cool. So, all right. So that's kind of it. Now we can jump to the chat app. And we went. Oh yeah, let me send that message. I forgot. All right.
How much time do you think you need to finish?
We could probably do this in 50 minutes, because what we're doing is we're just starting off with the entire finished application and then adding the API.
Okay.
and then walking through the code is
Nice.
really the main thing. Yeah.
Cool.
Because when you're looking at something like this is the app we're going to be playing around with. If we were to to write this from scratch, even in a workshop setting, it would probably take us a couple of days because there's so much code, boilerplate code. Well, I wouldn't say a couple of days. We could copy and paste, but if we were going to actually write the code ourselves, yeah, it might take a day or two because we have a bunch of different views, a bunch of routing, styling, all that stuff. What we're going to do though, instead, we're going to actually take what we've learned so far and kind of apply that to this. So what we'll do is we'll clone this application, we'll initialize the services that we'll need, and then we'll walk through some of the code. And we're actually going to be working here under build the app manually. We could just run Amplify init because when you actually have Amplify, an Amplify project with this Amplify folder, you can actually share this entire application to 1 million people, whoever has it, and all they need to run is Amplify init. And this will actually spin up the entire backend without you having to write the code each step by yourself. But I think since we are still kind of learning, we'll do the step-by-step example. So we'll install the CLI, which we already have. We don't need to do that. We'll clone the app, npm install to install the dependencies, Amplify init to initialize a new project after we delete the Amplify folder. And then we'll run Amplify add auth, Amplify add API. And this is the actual schema that we're working with. So this is a much more complicated schema. This is something that you probably would see in probably some of the more complex applications because we're using multiple directives. We have the @model directive to create a data source. We also have the @auth directive to give a couple of different rules around authentication for querying a user. We have the conversation type, the message type, and then we have a relation that we're creating between conversations and messages, which is this combo link type. And then we define our subscription because we want certain things to happen in the subscription. We want to subscribe to conversation IDs. We don't want to subscribe to an entire conversation. We only want to create a subscription based on the ID, which is a pretty important distinction because when you have some type of chat application, you're subscribing to these different conversations that people are having versus the entire table of conversations. And it's pretty easy to do that by just passing in an argument there. So I'll go ahead and start this by going back to this and cloning this project. And by the way, if you would like to delete the old project at any time, you can run the Amplify delete command, and that will tear down the entire backend. So just showing you how that works. But I guess I'll leave it just in case I want to get back and reference it for now. So in this folder where I have my Amplify app, I'll just clone this app sync chat app. After I clone the app, I'm going to remove the Amplify folder. And with that deleted, I'm going to run Amplify init to create a new Amplify project. All right, so for a name of the project, doesn't really matter, I don't think. I'm just going to walk through this, giving some basic information. amplify net, and we'll run amplify at auth and then amplify at API. So I'm on the auth part now, but we not be in sync depending on how fast or slow you are. And again, you can just choose the default configuration for the security like we did last time. Now, the main difference when we run amplify add API this time is when we're prompted for the authorization type, instead of choosing API key, we're going to choose Amazon Cognito user pool. Does anyone have a tissue here by any chance? I somehow cut my nose when I was shaving, and it just won't stop bleeding today. Anyway, so instead of the authorization type of API key like we did earlier, we're going to choose Amazon Cognito user pool, because after you run amplify at auth, you now have a user pool. So it will automatically recognize the user pool, and it'll say use a user pool that's already configured as part of this project. So it'll automatically detect that and kind of use it for you. And then do we have an annotated GraphQL schema? Well, we kind of do, but let's just no, because that way we can just have it opened up in our editor for us. And then we want to have a guided schema creation. Thank you. I'll choose yes. And then I'll choose single object with fields. Oh, I'm really sorry about that. Already canceled that meeting. And this will open it up in the editor again, just like last time. But instead of using this really basic type, we'll just copy and paste this really more complex type. So the main things to keep in mind here is that there are really just three main types that we're working with. We're working with the type of user, which is, of course, when we sign up a user, we want to have some type of way to reference that user in our database. We want to have a conversation, which is something like if I create a group message between me and two people, that's a conversation. And then a message is a item within a conversation. And so those are the three main types. The actual combo link isn't really a separate piece of data you're going to be working with directly. It's a relation between the other two pieces. And the connection, there's two connections that are being made, one between the user and one between the conversation. The way that these directives work, it might not be apparent right now because this is the first time looking at them. There's a little bit to learn and stuff about how this all stuff works. So if this doesn't make any sense, which it probably won't at first, check out the documentation, and then if you have any questions, you can always reach out to me or whatever. But typically, if you create a relation, you'll write the connection on the two different items that you want connected. So we'll go ahead and save that. And that is pretty much it, because all our app really needs is a GraphQL API that's authenticated and an authentication service, and we have both of those. So now we should be able to run amplify push. And we'll go ahead and create both of those features, the auth and the API together. Now, it's up to you if you'd like to create the GraphQL code locally, because I'll go ahead and open this up in the code editor to show you. The actual GraphQL operations that we're using for this app are a combination of regular strings, and we're also using GraphQL tag, because since we're using the Apollo client, you have to have GraphQL tag. So I have an actual GraphQL folder. GraphQL file, GraphQL.js. This actually holds all of the operations for this app. So you don't really need those code generated for this, since we're cloning a project. And that's it. We'll wait a couple of minutes because this will probably take maybe 1 to 2 minutes to create. And then we'll walk through it. Any questions about any of that stuff?
Is there any way to see like the billing of all the infrastructure and everything
that we're doing now?
Yeah.
Yeah, you can go to let's see here. So you can go to my account and then bills, and this shows service charge. Amplify is actually the Amplify console. We're not using that, so this is, you don't get charged for using the CLI. This is actually my entire account that I use for like hundreds of demos, like, and I have a bunch of apps running. So $13 a month is what I'm charging. It looks like EC2 is like the one thing I'm using the most of. My app sync stuff will be under DynamoDB, I think. So I'm using 55 cents this last billing period on DynamoDB.
Yeah, I think the pricing gives you rough idea. Also.
Yeah, it just gives you a rough idea. I mean, like what we're doing now is probably not
cheap.
going to cost you hardly, like if anything, nothing. Like if you left it like running and you hit requests over the course of like a year, you might have a few, like it would probably be like $1 or something like that. But like, yeah. But actually, if you want to know the app sync, this is actually going to be helpful. If you want to just look at the actual AppSync billing and how that works, you can Google. You can go to the AppSync billing documentation by googling AppSync billing or pricing, and it gives you some information. There's a free tier. If it's the first year, you have 200. Let's see what the free tier. 250,000 queries, 250,000 subscriptions, 600,000 connection minutes is part of the free tier. And then after you go over that, or if you're not in the free tier anymore, it's $4 per million query and data modification operations. For real-time subscriptions, it's $2 per million and 8 cents per million minutes. And then this is pretty interesting, this pricing example, because it gives you an example of an actual application that people have run and we've tested out. So a blog application with 50,000 monthly active users that each perform 100 searches. And these searches generate 5 million AppSync query operations per month with an average response size of 3 kilobytes. The query operations would cost you $20. The data transfer would cost you $1.29, and then the total, would be $21. The second one has a pricing model with subscriptions, and this comes out to be much less users. So 2,500 users with subscriptions comes out to be $15. So what I've noticed is if you build with AppSync and you don't take advantage of subscriptions, it ends up not being anything at all typically. If you do use subscriptions, make sure you're not subscribing to everything because if you are, then you'll start accruing charges. So if you're building a chat application, you do have to use subscriptions. So it does end up being a little expensive. I wouldn't say it's expensive, but it's much more expensive than just queries. But pricing, if you actually look at what the pricing we have compared to some similar services, from what I've seen, people think that it's less. But I would probably do some research there if you do get in that situation. So. All right, so I think if I go back to my CLI, it's still creating actually. I think it's, we're creating a couple of different tables actually. So if you look at all the at models that we have in our schema, every single one of those is its own data source. So if I go to schema, so we're basically creating three databases. So it does take a few minutes.
More water?
Yeah, I'll take them a little more if you don't mind.
I don't mind.
Thanks. So I guess while that's working, because it probably might take a while for everyone else too, We can go ahead and take a look at some differences between the other application that we worked with and the one we're working with now. And I think the main thing that the big difference that we'll look at is how we are querying for our data. Because before, when we were using Amplify, we were using the Amplify GraphQL client, but now we're using the Apollo client. So in index.js, you'll see that we have quite a bit more boilerplate. We are importing, I guess, these extra 4 lines here. So we're importing the AppSync client. We're importing this rehydrated component from AppSync React. We're importing the Apollo provider, which is what we use to pass down our client as context to our entire application. And we're also importing auth in index.js, whereas before we didn't import auth at all. And that's kind of the main difference in the imports. Another main difference is we're creating this client variable. So if you've ever worked with Apollo before, you've seen something like this where you create this client that contains your client configuration. Thank you. Typically, that'll be stuff like your URL and maybe, I think, I'm not sure how it works now, but maybe some information about how you set up your initial cache. So the one interesting thing that you'll see is the auth variable that we're passing in here. We're passing in the type, which this resolves to Cognito user pools. And then we're also passing in a JWT. And if you remember earlier when we were decoding our token on the client, we saw that we have this JWT. So we're actually just passing that as part of the client. So this gets sent with all of our requests by setting it like this. So we call auth.current session, similar to how we called auth.current authenticated user. And then we create a new component that we're going to be using as like the main default like app component. Instead of the app, we're actually creating a new component called app with provider, which has like 3 levels of nesting. At the top level, we have the Apollo provider where we just pass in the client. This is the exact same API as Apollo has if you've used it. Then we have another level nested where we have this rehydrated component. And we could either use rehydrated as like a child parent relationship, or we could do rehydrated and then have app as the 3rd level nested, or we can actually pass a render method to rehydrated. And this will basically, when the app first loads, we will be looking for the most recent cache. And once that resolves, we'll return the app. And then when it's not, before it resolves, we'll basically be like showing this loading component. The loading component, I think, is like, it's just like a yellow screen that has chat or something like that. But anyway, this kind of allows you to have like that loading screen. And then when we render our app, we're rendering the provider component versus just the app by itself. So that's one key difference. We're basically setting our client, at a top level. So down the road, we can now start accessing our client to make requests and stuff like that. So that's like the first main differentiator. So now that we looked at that, let's go ahead and run the app and see if this works. So we can run npm start. Oops. First, need to go ahead and install the dependencies. And again, well, I mentioned earlier that you can delete all this stuff pretty easily. If you go to the bottom of the GitHub repo we were looking at earlier, under removing services, this shows you how to delete all the stuff we created today, so you don't have to worry about this running up anything in your account. Just run amplify remove for the service and then amplify push. Or if you want to delete the entire project, did I not put that in here? You can run amplify delete. Let me just update this real quick to have that. Just want to have that in here.
Oh, it's over there. Amplifier remove.
Yeah, so this only removes a single like service.
Oh.
So you're like removing all. Yeah, so let me go ahead and put a new section for deleting. Project. To do that, just run amplify delete.
It's like you have some modules, you like npm packages you install and remove.
This will do two things. It'll delete this amplify folder entirely, and then it'll also delete everything in your account, so you don't have any stuff sitting around. Yeah. All right. Yeah. So that's there. If you want to reference that later. All right. So now that that's we've installed everything, we should be able to run npm start.
Another one question: how long is it gonna take in order to finish the demo?
We're done pretty much with the demo in the next few minutes left.
Yeah, because it's like nine.
Yeah, we finished in 15 minutes, right? Yeah, we're pretty much done. We're just gonna walk through the code and see if the app actually loads. So the app loads. We should be able to like do the same thing we did earlier. You notice that there's a slight difference in design in our with authenticator hardware component. So if we go to, I'll see where I made this component. I think it might be in the.
So it's customizable.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's customizable. I'm gonna have to do a search to see where this was. I forgot. Okay, so router. Where's router? Okay. So the with authenticator is like in our router, and we have this router config that we pass in. This has a theme variable where we customize the styling of the button and the anchor. So we should be able to sign up. So we sign in. We should see the upload. Nothing's in there though, because we don't really have any other we don't really have any way to chat because there's no other users using this app. But if we click on profile, we should see, have a little bit of information about the profile. This is done again using that auth class that we looked at earlier, where we call auth.current authenticated user. Right now, I'm storing this in MobX. What I actually want to do is make this entire thing offline. So if we go offline right now and we refresh, everything loads still. That error is out right now. All I need to do is move that into Apollo, which I should have done to begin with. So let's go ahead and create a new user again and create a chat. So I'm going to go ahead and open an incognito window here. And create another new account.
Well, who's doing that just to let you know that there's some pizza down like outside in the kitchen. So when we finish, we can run and eat some pizza and beer over there. and yeah, so just don't run down the hill. Just go to the pizza because I got some for you. It's pizza, yeah. So if there's any questions, just ask. Let us know.
All right, so the users, we should see Dabbit3 on her screen, and on my screen, I should see Jennifer. So now I can click on her name to create a new conversation. And over here, I'll go to Convos, click yes. I don't have a subscription, I guess, on Conversations, which is a shame. I should have done that. So if I go back to Conversations, we should see it show up now, but I should put a subscription on that as well. So now
that's gonna cost more. So maybe.
Yeah. Yeah. So if I click on our conversation, like nothing's going on yet, but if I create a message, and we should see it show up. There you go.
Wow.
Nice.
And there we go. So if I go back now to chat, I click here, see that. Now let's demo the offline piece because this we said works offline. So how do we test if it's offline? Well, we actually just, we could
just go offline.
Yeah, we could go offline, or we could do the profile thing. Let's do this because this might be easier. So I'm going to go ahead to network and go to offline. It's right there. It's barely visible. And I'm going to create a new message. Hey, I am offline. So this message went through, no errors, but it doesn't come through here because, they're not, it's offline, yeah. So what happens when the user comes back online? We can actually simulate that just by doing this. Whoops. And we see that the message goes through, comes up here. The network request actually went through as well. So if we go back off, we're online, everything's working. We go back offline again. The messages are all showing up for me. When I go back online, we see that they come through in the proper order. The way that works is we don't really have to do any extra coding. If we go to our conversation, yeah. This is being handled by the AppSync JavaScript SDK. We're basically leveraging a combination of the Apollo cache and Redux offline. All the offline stuff is done under the hood. If you use the Apollo API like you're used to using it by providing an update and an optimistic response, the offline is actually handled for you. So if you look at this is subscription, the create, this is kind of where we're doing the optimistic response. What's that?
Is this using Redux?
It's using no, it's not using Redux. We actually like the AppSync SDK that we installed is kind of using Redux in the background to handle the queuing up of offline mutations. So you create a mutation when they're offline. We timestamp it. We save it into a message queue. We add another one. When the user comes online, we send them up in the order that they were received.
And for production applications, do you think it's a good pattern that just put the mutations in a queue and then when you're back online?
Yeah, I mean, it seems to be working with so far. Well, we deal with the conflict resolution for you. So there is a conflict resolution. So for instance, you go offline, you come back online. What happens if someone else made an operation before you did? We handle that based on a set of smart defaults that we call those, mainly based around timestamps. But you actually can override the how that works. You have,
if someone updated the entity before you don't get through, or something like that.
So there's also another interesting thing that we have that's built into AppSync that was just released maybe a month ago. It's called let me see what the name of it is actually. There's too many different things at this point for me to remember everything. Oh, Delta Sync, yeah.
Delta Sync.
Yeah. So it just let me just see Delta Sync. So it basically does what it sounds like it does. It syncs the difference between the two. And this comes in handy for certain situations, but one of those is, for example, if you have an app where you have a large data set and the user goes offline and they come back online and there is changes between the two, what happens with Delta Sync is this client comes back online, we hit the database, say there's 1,000 records, but we already have 900 of those records already locally. It will change, it will look at the diff, the delta, which would be 100 records. and it'll only bring down those 100 records versus the entire 1,000. So it kind of
So you are
optimizes for payload size.
maintaining a duplication of the databases.
There is a duplication of the databases on the back end when you use Delta Sync. Yes.
Do you have any built-in to show the user that is offline?
We don't have that built in. Now you
So
have to handle
you
that
hit the
yourself.
proper. Okay, you use the normal like network.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. You could have a message that says, "Hey, you know."
Yeah, you're offline.
Yeah. But yeah, we don't handle that for you.
Because you want to like wait for a message from Jennifer, you need to know.
Yeah, for sure. It's important.
Nice.
And so like that's it. But like if you've ever written Apollo like code, you know, like this kind of looks familiar. It's kind of a pain because you have to like read the cache, and then you write to the cache and all this stuff. But what ends up happening again, the cache is now the offline cache as well. So like that's just kind of automatic at this point. You provide an update and optimistic response, and the offline part is handled for you. And then this is the subscription. And I mentioned earlier, like having a client ID, that's kind of what we're doing here.
Nice.
But yeah, so if you're interested in learning more about how this app works, you know, the main, I guess, components that do the functionality with the API are conversations, the individual conversation, of course, which are the messages, and then the conversations is actually like this, having all the items. So if anyone wants to do a pull request to add functionality,
free to do it. Nice.
Yeah, I think that's it. I don't think there's a lot else to go over. So I'll be happy to answer any questions if anyone has any at this point.
Any questions? Are you hungry?
Yeah.
Well, thanks again, Nader, for coming.
Thank you. I enjoyed being here.
Yeah, and let's just go for the pizza. That's it. Yeah. I think nobody's here in the office, so I think we can leave things here and then.
Yeah. There's no problem.
Right?
Let me unplug real quick. Are we good?
Are these yours?
That is, yeah, but he's here to pass them out, so I just want.
Dos horas?
I mean, it is good.
I want to speak that
So the error was because when we amplify push, we deleted the pattern for the file system.
Right, yeah.
Because I did the same, and that.
Yeah, I thought it was, but it shouldn't be that. Like, it should still work. So I think it's a bug. I'm gonna have to report it.
When I deleted the two, that's when it didn't work, and then I redo it
with the file path.
Yeah.
See, that's what I thought it was. And I was like, but if that's the case, that means it's a bug, and that's what it is. It's a bug.
Yeah. It maybe it doesn't recognize the pattern.
There must be some configuration that keeps that source directory or something.
Yeah.
And then it can't find it because we deleted that was the thing.
That's the conflict.
But thank you for the update.
No.
I was wondering that.
I actually missed a part of it because I was, I wanted to know what happened. Why?
I had a feeling that was it, but I'm glad to be confirmed.
Yeah. It was. I confirmed it in a moment.
Nader? Can we do a picture?
Yeah, let's definitely do it.
Thank you.
Yeah, totally. Who knows when I'll be back? Oh, I'll see you twice this year. We're not talking about.
We're gonna see us like twice more times. Yeah, 2 more times.
React Europe, right?
Yeah, React Europe and React Amsterdam. Oh,
I can't wait for React Amsterdam. Actually, I can't wait for both of those. Those are like two of my favorite conferences.
Yeah.
Paris and Amsterdam.
Paris was really good last year.
Yeah.
I didn't go last year. Was it good?
Yeah, it was really good.
React Europe?
It was surprisingly more React Native than React.
Oh, really? I don't believe that. Really?
Yeah.
Oh, shit.
Yeah, it was a lot of things, and some like really advanced stuff about GraphQL. So it was.
Last year.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Richard, the guy that works with me, speaking of React Europe this year,
Oh,
we're doing a workshop similar to what we did here.
that's great. Yeah. I don't think I'm gonna do work. I did the workshop, the Advanced React Native workshop last year.
Yeah.
With Brent and who else was Evan and all those guys.
Shit.
And but yeah,